Thank you, Jody. It is really a treat to be back here at Harvard. 19 years ago, I took Professor Hoare's Land Use Law and Policy course in the building next door. And as a result of that and my experiences in California, knowing I was going to give the lunchtime keynote, I had to bite my tongue all morning long. I am going to address the innovation question in just a few minutes. I want to thank Jody and Richard for inviting me, Bill and his co-authors who are here for contributing to this debate about how to steward urban growth. I really appreciated Gerald's erudite genealogy of the discourse around these areas and Chris's empirical basis, and a lot of what was said this morning I'm going to build off of. I am going to focus really on a subset of the goals that are set forth in the use of land. I'm going to focus on the question of how we going forward try and improve the livability, sustainability, and health of communities. I'm going to leave aside housing as an issue and really restrict my focus on those specific goals. And I want to, if Bill would permit me, be a little provocative and draw some contrasts. The use of land was written at a time where the greatest threat was perceived to be population growth and rapid, unchecked urban growth. And nature was in conflict with that. And there's a lot of focus on preserving nature and what to do about growth. The premise of my perspective and my thesis is really going to be that much like the universe will eventually experience, we've expanded our cities to their perimeter, and now they're likely to shrink a little bit spatially. And the question is, how do we live and achieve these goals within that new footprint? And so I'm going to argue that, and my thesis right up front, so you can agree or disagree as we move forward, is the real question is how we regenerate our urban fabric, how we regenerate our cities, and that success is going to be measured in terms of strategies that effectively retrofit all dimensions at all scales of urban life, from the inside of this building to its footprint, to the neighborhood, to the transportation and utility systems that support it, and how we retrofit, how we replace, how we infill. And I'm going to suggest that in telling California's story, we have an example of innovation that operates outside of the traditional land use policy tools. Not that it hasn't suffered from their poor use, but that the success I'm going to describe it's an innovation in reaching for another set of policy tools to accomplish these goals of sustainability and healthy growth. And that in focusing on infill and replacement, one of the things that we want to do is we want to change the DNA that allows the city to reproduce itself, right? And that DNA is going to be, and one of the things we've got to ask is, what specifically do we want to accomplish in trying to embed DNA in the policies I'm going to talk about in just a minute? And I would suggest to you that first and foremost, we want to slow down the urban metabolism as it's embedded in energy, water, and transportation technologies, so that we consume more efficiently these resources in urban areas. We produce less pollution, they cost us less, we become more resilient to shocks in either their availability or their price, right? So slowing down the urban metabolism in these respects is one goal. A second is we want policies that creates new space for nature in the urban setting, that bring nature, that recreate it. The city that I live in has very limited nature, and the prospects really are, we're not going to, the conflict isn't between protecting nature and growth, it's really how do we reintroduce natural spaces and growing spaces into our urban setting. And then third, how do we create new spaces in this existing urban environment that fosters social interaction and cultural interaction in new ways that kind of through redesigning our sidewalks, our parklets, our parks, allow our children, our seniors, our families to connect with each other, right? So those are the three goals for the DNA. And what are the policy tools that I'm going to focus on in California's story? They're essentially going to be building codes, street design codes, utility and transportation policies. And land use is going to be there as a complement, but it's really not going to be the central focus of California's experience. Now, how many people have been to Southern California in the room? Okay, most of us. That's great. So one of the questions you might ask is, I was asked to talk about California's experience and share kind of what the successes and failures have been with respect to urban growth. And one of the things that you all who have been there know is Californians love to experiment on ourselves. We don't just have one solar policy, we have 6 or 7 solar policies going at once. And we're willing to try it all. So it's a really rich laboratory. And a second reason to focus on California is we have really taken the lead in climate change policy. And if you want to know what that means for states that will follow, you can learn a lot about how our governance structure and how climate change has unified many of these forces that are going to be transforming the urban fabric at the local level. The last thing I would say about California, the reason to focus on California, is there seems to be something working there. And I think we'd all agree historically, California, and especially Southern California, were synonymous with the nation's worst air pollution, water pollution. We had electricity brownouts for 2 decades, gas guzzling cars, uncontrollable sprawl, a deserted downtown like many of the California cities, and other cities across the nation. And yet, over the last 3 decades, we have dramatically improving air quality. Total and per capita water and energy consumption have been declining for the last 3 decades. We have 50,000 zero-emission electric vehicles on the road, 230,000 residential solar systems. We have very low carbon electricity, increasing urban density. Our downtowns are coming back with a vengeance, and a nascent but very fervent complete and living streets movement, which is really trying to take back the spaces that exist and repurpose them for local community needs. So what's made California's advance towards these, what's made its transformation possible? Well, I think, without overreaching, I think the first thing we have to do is recognize the forces that have already been identified, the market forces, right? Housing prices, gasoline prices, energy prices have all increased over the last 3 decades. And then, as Chris Nielsen so artfully pointed out, the demography of California cities and other cities are changing dramatically and becoming younger and more immigrant-oriented. And I have to say, in this audience, I feel like to some extent I'm the young whippersnapper. I had to raise my hand for the pre or post 64 cutoff. And and there are 2 other generations of younger people, standing behind me that could attest to the attraction of very dense urban environments and the kinds of new urban vision that I'm discussing here that's been piloted in California. But California has also adopted, and here's where the innovation comes in, a mosaic of policy and planning tools that have to be credited with its progress as well. And I think I'd be remiss if I didn't focus a little bit on the land use strategies that have been implemented. California, in addition to adopting a cap and trade program, which it's now well into on the electricity side and the industrial emissions side, is expanding that to transportation and transportation fuels. And so soon we will have a cap that covers most of the greenhouse gas emitters in the entire state. And of course, that's changing electricity prices, it's changing fuel prices, and that's helping with this. But on the land use side, one of the innovative things that they've adopted is what's called the Sustainable Community Strategy. And MPOs have been required to set greenhouse gas emission targets and to undertake the usual planning exercise of identifying where density can be located along transit corridors with the goal of reducing VMT. And they were supposed to submit their proposed targets to ARB, the Air Resources Board, the state agency in charge of this, for approval, right? And the incentive that exists at the local level is that developers who comply in building these areas are exempt from CEQA review, right? Exempt from CEQA review, which is a big plus in California, and has made, CEQA review has made development in dense areas very, very difficult in many instances. Now, I have to tell you the political story of this is all the MPOs looked at the forecasts, declining VMT and declining reductions in the way, and they set their targets at just what would happen based on past trends. So they were not very ambitious, and ARB said, oh, well, you're proposing a reduction, so we'll accept it. Right, so this was at a time when, I think everybody wanted this to be seen as a successful policy. It's very much a policy that just codifies what would have happened anyway in terms of these declining emissions. So I think SB 375, which the new targets will have to be set in another couple of years, it gives us at least a framework and a focal point for doing traditional land use planning, transportation planning in ways that can help us reduce GHGs. But it's really not what is driving our improvements. And if I had to sort of focus on what's driving the improvements that I talked about, I would say it's an all of the above strategy, by and large. And the way to think about this is a sort of a concentric set of circles. At the center is all of the energy-consuming and water-consuming technologies in this room. And then and we have building codes and appliance codes that we have tightened down over time. And then there's the building itself, its albedo effect, its ability to host solar, its ability to host electric vehicle charging infrastructure, all of which are defined by green building codes, which are now so stringent that it's made LEED certification pretty much obsolete in California. Our own local green building codes go well beyond that for the buildings that have to be compliant now. And then, let me just catch up with myself. For the parcel itself, moving outward, there are a variety of guidelines on stormwater capture and other best practices for the site design. All of this, remember, is with an eye towards how do we take the existing built environment and reform it, right? And the next set of innovations, I think, are probably the most important because they don't actually require changing that much that's going on in the existing structure. The utility system that brings energy and water to the building is one of the areas where we've been most aggressive, and it's happened at the state level and gotten delegated down to the utilities. So we have these portfolio standards for electricity describing how much of it has to be renewable. We are pushing for water to be produced and recycled and have targets for water recycling. On site, we're creating incentive systems and credits for gray water reuse and on-site solar. So that's the utilities sort of coming in and complementing the system. Then there's the transportation options. And this is where I think we're pushing the hardest right now. And we also have the farthest to go. But we have an extremely aggressive set of state policies to reduce the emissions from vehicles. And the goal of getting to 1.5 million electric vehicles by 2020, only 5.5 years away, is probably a stretch, but will probably only fall short by maybe 35% at this rate. And that's requiring really transforming the built environment to host electric charging stations where parking spaces were before and remain. Right? So we're reformatting these spaces to make room for these new innovative technologies. So in addition to the transportation options, there's the transportation infrastructure. And I know the room is full of students of urban planning in all of its forms, and I think we all know the distorting effects that the street design guidelines and the minimum parking requirements have imposed on the urban form. And so much of what's going on right now at a social level is going into neighborhoods and trying to ensure that when streets are redesigned, that redesign takes into account the other purposes besides trying to move a vehicle as quickly as you can along the street that the street can serve. And so there's a complete, I'm not sure how familiar you are, but there's a movement called Complete and Living Streets, which is really taking things block by block, street by street, and asking, how do we repurpose the space? Yes, we may still have to move vehicles along it, but not all the time. In LA, one of the things that we do is we shut down our main streets and we basically have a street fair, a ciclovia, where everyone comes out and mixes and mingles. And increasingly, whether it's for farmers markets or what have you, there are these kinds of efforts. And it's actually, I think it's one of the most challenging transformations that we're trying to bring about because it involves dealing with the Department of Planning, the Department of Transportation, the Department of Street Services, all at once, right? If you want to get a parklet put in and take away 2 parking spaces, if you want to introduce more trees, or safer pedestrian crossings, or widen the sidewalk to enhance the cafe culture in a redeveloped area, it's not a simple exercise. But changing that transportation infrastructure, which, as was pointed out, represents so much of the space that's available, and figuring out how to repurpose that is really become a central focus of this effort. So concentric circles, a variety of policy tools are being used, I think, and have brought about many of these improvements. And just to kind of recap a little bit, the goals of these policies have been to improve the livability and the sustainability of an existing urban environment by slowing down the metabolism of the technologies that are embedded everywhere that consume energy, water, transportation fuel, to create new natural spaces where they didn't exist before. One of the challenges with density, and you look at any urban city, you go to the most dense places, it has the smallest growing spaces. Most of us don't even think about what's a growing space. Well, a growing space is a place where you can see dirt, right, or plants or vegetation. And in most cities, that's where it's needed the most, but there's the least of it, right? And so there's some inherent tensions there. And then last of all, trying to create more social and recreational spaces, right? We are a park-poor city. Most cities are park-poor, especially in areas where there are young families and immigrant families. The streets, the sidewalks can be repurposed to support those things. That's what we have to work with. Now, the California strategy, I would call it, and I don't want to oversell it as Californian, but it's a lot. There's a UCLA basketball coach that used to say, "Don't let what you can't do keep you from doing what you can do." We have failed at land use policy planning by and large, but we have really tried to make progress using these other policy tools for which there was less political opposition. And I think that we've made some success. However, in many ways, some of these policies we've implemented for 2 or 3 decades, and we can now see the fruit of. Others are much more recent. And I just want to sort of close by focusing on some of the challenges that these policies raise as strategies for improving the sustainability and livability of our cities. First, retrofitting, replacing, infill, it's expensive, right? It's expensive. Second, much of these policies focus on what are essentially rental properties, whether it's residential renting or whether it's commercial leasing. And that complicated ownership structure makes it difficult for tenants to benefit from putting solar on the rooftop, makes it difficult for tenants to benefit from putting charging stations out front, from adopting some of these innovative technologies, which in fact the federal government spends a lot of its efforts trying to reduce the cost of and make more effective. So there are, I think, the more we become a renting society, both in the commercial sphere and the private sphere, the more we're going to have to deal with the split incentives and how we transform our urban environment in the face of those split incentives, and figure out how to share those benefits. Third, these policies, in large part, especially changing the building envelope and making that more efficient, depend on replacement, the rates of replacement. And the building stock, in at least the towns I'm familiar with, they change extremely slowly, very, very, very slowly. So the opportunities to redesign the building's envelope don't happen very often. And I heard Mary Nichols, the chairwoman of the California Air Resources Board, acknowledge publicly that California will never reach its aggressive climate goals unless 75% of all the building envelopes are replaced, so they're more efficient, right? And this is a state that's pretty Mediterranean by and large. Just imagine the challenges that other states are going to face. And then third, and I'll close on this, I mean, it's actually the fourth concern, social equity. The California experiment has not gone without some inequitable consequences. I'll just give you two examples and then one example of how we're trying to redress that. I think the thing that we've been most noted for is our push on solar and our push on electric vehicles. And we've gotten them out there. But 95% of both have gone to single-family homeowners. And as we know, 65% of residents in urban areas live in multifamily housing, either condos or apartments. And so the success has highlighted for many residents in urban areas that they can't participate in and take advantage of the benefits that are provided by these rebates. And so for both solar power, the rejoinder, the second generation of policies focused explicitly on enhancing the allocative equity, basically, has been community solar. So you build a big solar system and you can buy shares in it as an apartment owner or a condo owner because you can't host on your own rooftop. For electric vehicles, the response has been to take the rebates and increase the rebates that are available to means test them, essentially. So give larger rebates to drivers that have lower incomes and are more likely to be driving more polluting cars that you would replace otherwise. So in each case, there's been a backlash coming from the sort of the land use patterns that have resulted from this multifamily housing development, and we're trying to figure out solutions. It's slow. They're not easy. I'll just mention that one of the things that's happening right now is our cap and trade program is generating hundreds of millions of dollars of revenues. And we have a law, it's called SB 535. We can't come up with good, names for these things. And it requires a mere 25% of those revenues be invested in disadvantaged communities. And the push right now from the environmental justice community in California is, we all know that the compliance cost of these changes are high. Energy costs go up, fuel costs go up. I mean, it's one of the things that's driving these patterns already. And the way that you make sure that these policies don't disadvantage poor households is by helping them adopt technologies that reduce the quantity of these resources that they consume in the first place, so that the unit price might go up, but their monthly bill doesn't go up, right? That's the strategy that the environmental justice advocates want to see happen. The only way that we're going to do this in this environment where most of those individuals are renters, and low income, and they don't have a lot of money to buy these technologies that help reduce their transportation. I drive a Leaf, an electric vehicle. But my monthly fuel cost went from $200 a month for my car down to $30 a month for my car. It was big cost savings. All I have to do is plug in every night when I get out to a 110 outlet. most multifamily residents are not going to have an opportunity to reduce their fuel costs by that much. And so what SB 535 is trying to do, and we don't know if it's going to work very well, and that there's going to be a large legislative commitment, but begin to offer the households in these disadvantaged communities the opportunities to adopt energy efficient, water efficient, more transportation fuel efficient technologies, so that they can not be overly impacted by compliance with these goals. So I hope that that my thesis that these other policies have allowed us to improve and achieve some of the goals that were laid out by the uses of land falls into the innovative category, which is the theme we just picked up on. And we're still very much a work in progress. So thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to taking questions or whatever. Yeah.